Hi folks, Mr. Vini here, talking about life in ancient Rome, and today we're going to look at the Roman civilization. We're going to start by looking at some Roman culture. One thing you need to know is the Romans admired the Greeks, admired the Greek art, the Greek architecture, but a big difference was the Romans, when they built their statues, they made them more realistic. They included the flaws of people, where when the Greeks made theirs, they showed people as if they were perfect. Romans used arches, one of the things they added, and domes in their buildings. They also used the columns like the Greeks, but they used arches in them. And then finally, they invented and used concrete, which is why many of the buildings today are still around. Let's talk a little bit about Roman literature. Roman authors based much of their writings on the Greek works. One famous one was Virgil, and he wrote an epic poem called the Aeneid. There's Horace, and Horace is famous for writing satires, which poke fun at human weakness. He also wrote odes, which are poems that express strong emotions about life. Now, some Roman science and engineering took place, and Galen brought many medical ideas to Rome. He's one that emphasized the importance of anatomy. Then there's a guy by the name of Ptolemy, and he studied the sky and actually mapped out over 1,000 stars. And then we had engineers, and they built roads, they built bridges, and they built aqueducts like you see in the picture here. Now, daily life in Rome is important. At the center of Rome was what was called the Forum, which was a public square, and that's where people went to meet. They had a market there. You can see a lot of the different government buildings were there. Wealthy Romans at the time, they lived in large houses, had many rooms, actually had, heating, they had running water. They lived very nice, but only about 10% of the people in Rome were wealthy. About 90% were poor, and these poor people lived in crowded apartments called islands. They'd be an entire city block. They'd be about 6 stories high. They were made out of wood, and they were very dangerous. The government provided what was called bread and circuses, which would be free grain and then shows like chariot races or gladiator contests, and that was to keep the people happy. Now let's take a look at family life in Rome. Families were very large, and they were very important. A family not only included the mother and father and children, but it could include aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, second cousins, very large families. The paterfamilia, or father of the family, had total control over all the family members. He could arrange weddings, he would discipline, he'd do whatever needed to be done to make sure that the family would strive. Boys, they were educated. They'd learn how to read, write. They actually did a little bit of rhetoric, which was public speaking, and they usually went to school to learn that. Where girls, on the other hand, would stay home, and they could learn some of those also, but they were more taught household duties and how to take care of the home. Now, women in Rome is another topic we'll need to talk a little bit about. Women had some rights, but women were not citizens. Wealthy women had it the best. They had a lot of independence because they had servants or slaves to do a lot of the work. However, as I said before, most women weren't wealthy, and they spent their time at home. They could help their husbands run shops. They cook, clean, teach their daughters, so they were pretty busy. Now, slavery. That's one more thing I'd like to talk about. Roman slavery. The use of slaves grew as Rome conquered more lands. And the reason why that took place was, as they started conquering other lands and seeing how wealthy the people there were, they realized that slavery might be the reason why they're so rich. So they started to enslave more and more people. By 100 BC, about 40% of the people in Italy were slaves. That's 4 out of 10. Slaves could work in homes. They could work in the fields, they could work in the mines, sometimes they were in the workshops, sometimes they built roads and bridges. Spartacus is probably one of the most famous slaves. He was a gladiator, and he actually led a slave revolt. It became pretty famous, but in the end, he was defeated. Now, one last thing I'd like to mention before we're done is Roman religion. The ancient Romans worshipped many gods and goddesses, and actually many of their gods and goddesses were based on the Greek ones, but they were given Roman names. They honored their gods by worshiping and offering food. And a lot of times they borrowed ideas from the Greeks about philosophy as well. Now Christianity, as mentioned before, becomes a dominant religion in Rome, and at one point actually becomes the only religion allowed in Rome. So Christianity. So as time went by, Romans went from worshiping many gods to worshiping only one God, and that was because of Christianity. Well, that's a little bit about life in ancient Rome, Roman civilization. We covered several topics. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in class.